Hello. Today I want to show you how you can use the camera built into your cell phone to take really good documentation photos of your work. The camera on your phone is surprisingly good at this if you follow a few simple photography rules. The first thing we should probably do is to define what good documentation looks like. Your goal should be to make your work look as good as possible. And the best way to do that is to make sure your background is not distracting, to make sure that the piece that you're photographing doesn't have too many shadows cast on it and that it's not casting shadows on itself. So your lighting needs to be really good. And you want to make sure that you're taking a good photo, that the angle of your camera makes sense, that you're not too far away, that you're not too close, and that your work is generally centered in the frame. Sometimes this control is taken out of your hands, like if you have a site-specific piece that's been built on location, or if your work was assembled in a gallery somewhere, in which case you sort of just have to do the best you can. You can only control the variables that you can control, and I think generally it's pretty obvious when this is the case, and it won't hurt the documentation of the work. This video is going to focus on photographing sculpture, but the principles that I'm going to talk about can mostly translate to photographing 2D art like drawings and paintings as well, especially when we talk about lighting your subject indoors. Photographing sculpture involves some unique challenges because you're using a two-dimensional medium to try and capture a three-dimensional object. So typically you want to try to take a few different photos, 2 or 3 at least, to capture a few different sides, left side, right side, front, back, and you may want to include a detail shot if you think your work warrants it. You will need something to support your sculpture. It doesn't have to be a pedestal. A small table or a stool can work just fine. Try to get something that looks nice. And you also want to think about what's in your background and what's in your foreground. Maybe don't shoot in front of a dirty wall. Try to use a clean wall. If there's a cardboard box in the background, get it out of the way. And then think about how you're framing your shot. Look at the lighting. See if you're casting a shadow that's distracting on the background. If you are, you can zoom in a little bit and step back away from the piece, and maybe your shadow won't show up in the background anymore. The thing that you're going to be fighting the most when you're documenting a sculpture will be shadows. And the best thing you can do to mitigate that problem is to just take the work and photograph it outside on a cloudy day. You don't want a lot of direct sunlight, so just after sunset when there's still plenty of ambient light but the sun is not in the sky, or on an overcast day, those are going to be your best times to photograph your work outdoors. You want to think about your shooting location. Is the background distracting? What does the foreground look like? What does the background look like? Is there texture? Does your background highlight your piece? Does it just detract from it? Does it distract? Those are all things that you need to think about. And you know, everyone's going to have a different location depending on where you live, what kind of environment you have. So again, it's sort of just about working with what you've got and doing the best you can with the background that you have, whatever you can find. The other thing that you want to think about is the angle that you're holding your camera. You can get a drastically different feeling from a sculpture depending on where you're holding your camera. In this example, I'm holding my camera up high and looking down at the sculpture. And as you can see, if we flip over to another shot where I'm beneath it, we get a very different feeling from this photograph. You should absolutely take some time to consider these factors when you're setting up, when you're shooting, because it will impact how people feel when they see the documentation of the work. If you're unable to get outside and use the ambient light on a cloudy day, and you are forced to shoot indoors, there are a few things you can do. You can set up lamps, one on either side of the piece. Try to get them at a 45-degree angle to the back wall. You want to make sure you're using 2 light bulbs that are the same type. What you don't want is warm light from one side and cool light from the other, or all of your photos will come out looking weird. It's also important to have 2 light sources, or you'll end up with dark shadows on one side of the piece. As soon as the second light comes on, you see that the lighting really evens out across the entire piece, which will give you a much more polished look. Again, we want to think about controlling our foreground and our background. And in some cases, it's as easy as laying down a sheet of clean white paper. But if you really want to step it up to the next level, you can make what's called an infinity wall by laying a sheet of paper against the wall and letting it slope down onto the surface that your sculpture is resting on. It's such a simple and inexpensive trick, but it can really make your shots look professional. When I was just starting out, I used to use the back of a roll of wrapping paper to make my faux infinity walls. It doesn't have to be something you spend money on. Because the sculpture I'm filming is white paper, I felt like there wasn't enough contrast between my piece and the background, so I decided to switch things up and make a black paper infinity wall, which is totally okay. The most common kind of infinity wall is a white background, but there's nothing stopping you from using black paper or even something like burlap or a sheet with texture on it. This can really be experimental. Once you get your photo onto your phone, you may want to do some touch-ups. Your phone is going to have some basic but perfectly serviceable editing software built in. I'm using an Apple phone. But if you're using an Android phone, you'll have something very similar to what I'm going to show you here. The most useful features that you're going to find are probably going to be with like crop and rotation tools. So cropping means cutting off some of the corners. So like in this case, I'm editing a drawing and I want to get rid of the walls. So I'm going to just sort of like crop in and cut down on the visible area. And then down at the bottom, I can use my thumb to sort of scroll left and right and adjust the tilt of the image. So the other thing that I've done is I was a little bit too low when I took the photo. This is called keystoning, what I'm doing right now, where you can adjust the angle of the image and sort of widen the bottom or narrow the bottom. So you're adjusting that keystone shape of the photo. If you need to adjust things like the color balance or the white balance, you definitely want to avoid any one-button auto adjustment. They don't work, especially when you're photographing artwork. They don't understand. You may be drawing on cream-colored paper, and it's going to try to balance it to white. So you really want to do this by hand. On iOS, you can sort of scroll through and make these adjustments very easily, and I'm sure on an Android phone, it's about the same. When I took this photo, some of the table was showing, so I'm just going to go in quick and adjust the crop so that that doesn't show up anymore. The truth of this is, though, the more time you spend in your initial setup, getting your lighting right and framing your shot, the less work you have to do later. Because when you do these edits, you always lose a little bit of something. When you crop some of the edges, you lose resolution, so you're not getting as detailed a shot as you could have if you didn't have to crop it. And when you make white balance or color corrections after the fact, you're also sort of introducing a bit of imitation into your photo. That's not to say there's anything wrong with making adjustments, but you will get better results if you don't fall into that old filmmaker's trap of trying to fix all your problems in post.